Eccoci, welcome everyone to what is the second live stream event of the Italian Studies Research Seminar Series at the University of Utrecht. And it's a real pleasure today to have with us Federica Pedriali, connected from Edinburgh. So thank you, Federica, for being with us. And as you can guess, for today, we will switch from languages for sure at the end with a Q&A. So questions in Italian and in English are welcome. But for the event itself, we'll keep and we'll stick with English. And very briefly, before giving the floor to Federica Pedriali, I would like to briefly present her to you, although I'm sure that it doesn't come as a news. And so very, very briefly, Federica Pedriali is Professor of Literary Meta-Theory and Modern Italian Studies at the University of Edinburgh and a research affiliate at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And her work spans biopolitics, cognitive narratology, continental philosophy, decolonial studies, migration and diaspora studies, environmental humanities, performance studies, and political theory. And she founded and is the general editor of the Edinburgh Journal of Gada Studies and established the Edinburgh Gada Prize. And she's currently researching biopower, dissonant heritages, and the futures of change, with previous work on the spatialities of war, totalitarian Europe, and digital humanities. And Pedriali has authored over 24 volumes, including monographs, regular and special issues, single and joint edited volumes, and reference works. And I just would like to mention very briefly some of her most recent publications, which include as editor Roberto Esposito's Italian Thought for EUP, which is currently in press, if I'm not mistaken, and then co-edited Mobilizing Cultural Identities in the First World War with Pelgrim Macmillan. We are in 2020 here. And as editor again, Garda Interpreti a Confronto for Cesati Editore, still in 2020. And she secured an MHRA research associateship to complete the print edition of the Gada Encyclopedia for Fabrizio Serra, forthcoming in 2026, and is currently working on two further edited volumes, the Roberto Esposito Dictionary and Italy by Design, Materiality and Commodification. I think that I will keep it as short as I can because I'm really excited to hear about today's seminar, which is titled From Print to Pixels on the Futures of Literary Objects. And just to say thank you so much, Federica, for being here. I really look forward to listening to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele. This is a real pleasure. I'm just waiting, yes, to see my screen appear. This is great. I'm also checking that things are all ready here. I just need to go back, sorry, to the very beginning of the slides, because we were testing stuff before, and just to be on, the safe side of technology. So thank you very much for joining us. It is a delight to be speaking from it has been a wonderful day in Edinburgh, a wintry day with wonderful sunshine. And from that sunshine, here I come with my first image. From print to pixels on the future of literary objects. I'm also playing on that separation of the two elements, objects. Why? This is an image of Sputnik. Sputnik, the first Earth's artificial satellite that was launched into space in 1957. And I'm using this, not that it has got much to do with books or literary objects, because this is an artificial object. And I want to bring it in, not just because it's a brilliant image, a very aspirational, motivational image, but also because it triggered an entire literature or very many responses at very various levels. And one of them was from Hannah Arendt as part of the preface of the human condition or on the human condition. And the other one was by Adorno. So I'm starting off with these two eminent intellectuals of the time who reacted immediately. On the Human Condition came out in 1958, so close to the launch of Sputnik, which, by the way, in Russian means co-traveler, co-pilot, companion. And there it goes. You know, we're already linking up with the current wave of naming the AI that is going to support us into the launch or for the launch into the future. So Hannah Arendt wrote in 1958 about Sputnik, whereas Adorno did write a bit later as part of a collected volume of essays where, observing at night the sky, he was looking for Sputnik. So Hannah Arendt, her comment is that basically by launching this artificial object into the night sky or into the sky, we're actually leaving behind our terrestrial nature. And so again, this is something that resonates very deeply with today's debate about us being terrestrial beings and having to recognize our roots staying firm on the ground, and rather than again follow our aspiration for the heights and meaning for the sky, we should be looking at the current state of emergency of the planet. So develop a form of planetary thinking that allows us to be more happily inhabiting the earth. So her thought is very much in line, not with an anti-technological thinking, but very much in line with the present thinking about where we're going next. With Adorno, and I think that this is more interesting from my perspective, given the kind of stuff that I will be handling with my presentation on literary objects specifically, is that he's looking from this Swiss Alp resort at night for Sputnik in the sky. And he has this comment which goes more or less along these lines. You know, in looking for Sputnik in the sky, I was looking for that special signature, for the man-made object, for the artificial object, for the object that doesn't shine like a star, that doesn't look like a planet, but looks like a man-made object. So this is where I start and I kick off. The other one that I want to use still in this first cover slide, as I say thank you to Adele, is really to think about the word object itself. And here I have two texts. By the way, all of my references will come towards the end of the talk as a kind of reference list. I hope it will be maybe helpful or useful for further exploration. So basically, I have Raymond Baudet in mind, his book that came out in the English version as with the title The Love of Things, The Love of Objects. And basically, object is described as the kind of thing that is objecting to us. Object means, you know, thrown about, but with a frontal orientation that basically speaks back to us, i.e., the object out there is resisting in some ways our very placing of it in the domain of things. So the life of things, the life of objects is, you know, a term of reference for me here, so objects. But also, I've got another interesting thinker, writer, scholar in mind, and that is Ian Hodder, with the book that came out a few years ago by now, 2012. He's an archaeologist, a British archaeologist based at Stanford, and his work on entanglement, the entanglement between humans and things as we place them once again out there in a domain that coincides with our dwelling, with our inhabiting the earth, basically is that by placing them there, we're also downloading ourselves. We are inscribing, of course, in the very making of objects, we're inscribing ourselves into them. But also, once they are out there, they demand things of us. So it's a constant renewal of a negotiation between the objecting power of the object, understood in the way Raymond Baudet describes it to us, with the materiality of the object that does require maintenance. For instance, this image is, well, not this image, this object is a reconstruction of Sputnik. So Sputnik itself, you know, deteriorates and decays and does require maintenance, even in the museum of things that we have produced. So this is my introduction in very many ways, because I do have books in mind. And this is my, well, sort of flying object. And it comes as part of my prompt and prop At the same time, I don't want to handle the book in question yet. I want to talk about the book, because the book has been with us, especially in its print format, in its democratized format, basically has been with us only for as long as the printing press, and increasingly so. And in very many ways, it created the habitat for a certain type of use of ourselves as subjects. You can say that it is through the book, about obviously also through other very many things, that we became the Kantian subject, if you want to put it as brutally as this. But certainly, the use of the book requires a certain environment, so that environment has got to be set up. So that's how, in the Hodder sense, we become increasingly entangled and almost cluttered by things, because each of them requires something else that is nested together with the rest in order to produce a certain ultimate output, which is ourselves as the contemporary of our use. So the book required institutions, it required production, it required, a certain type of privacy, for instance, like the study that you see at my back. The study that you see at my back, it may be my office, and it is my office in Edinburgh. At the same time, it is also the space where, look at them, the books are there, they're lined, they are not cluttering my space, they've been organized in such a ways as so that I can feel confident and comfortable in their company. They are a form of Sputnik. There is nothing more artificial, not just than the book, but myself as a reader. The skills required by reading, the privacy, the kind of detachment, autonomy from the environment, the space, the time that you require to read, at least until now, was a certain kind of myself. And that myself coincides maybe with European modernity, with Western modernity, whatever. But at the same time, it's certainly, dictating a number of possibilities in the uses of us. This is morphing, this is changing, and the prop and prompt that are brought to the fore is part of, in a way, an extension of the invention of the book, so as to cover that transition period that we're facing, i.e., we face challenges, but also we want to change. And in wanting to change, we demand not just new tools, but also that the old tools adapt. In the meantime, we are not yet there to a new form of modernity, but we are still in the framework, if you want, of a number of set of tools that are linked to each other, and they still produce, in a sense, the maintenance of each other. The libraries are still there, the printing presses are still there, the books are still very successful. So this particular book that I'm going to introduce tonight, and it's a departure for me from my usual repertoire of books, it's a book by, well, in theory, by Joanna Walsh. I don't know whether she's known to us, it doesn't matter. She is Joanna Walsh. If I read, however, the cover says book by Joanna Walsh, but inside it, the very first thing that you see is what looks like, well, something that you can't read. But basically, it does tell you the number of authors that have contributed to this speculative nonfiction. So the book declares that Miscommunication, which is the title of the book we're going to look at, is by, it's a non-speculative fiction by Joanna Walsh, who we take to be a human. And the rest are Constance Markievicz, the Dublin Bells, somebody else, I can't remember now, and then finally Markievicz Mark I. As you start looking around for information about this thin little book, which I've already covered in very many post-its, just to aid my navigation, which again is part and parcel of the use of the book. I mean, the book is a physical object that allows you in very many ways to make your imprint, to inscribe it with yourself, whether through post-its or direct writing on the page. As you start looking around for, but what is this book all about, given that on the cover you've only got one author, whom you take to be a human, and the rest instead is a long list of strange names. Who are the Dublin Bells, for instance, or who is this Markievicz Mark I? So as you look around, you come to basically the online part of the book. And as you explore it, this would be an animated text. You see it as a screenshot that I've taken not to sort of risk having, a failure, a technical failure with a live navigation. But basically what both the book and the online extension of the book, and I'm talking about extension because we are extending tools to do something else than they have usually done up to now. And this particular text has got this online extension that in an animated way tells you the following, that an artificial intelligence is sitting at the end of the world. Post-humanity, she is in dialogue with a past that no longer exists. Reading the personal writings of Irish women, eyewitnesses, accounts, interviews, letters, to generate new writing. A future Sibyl, she is programmed to continue to write, even when there is no one left to read. It's a challenge. Now, online, just to stay with the physicality of the use of ourselves as we become more and more acquainted with additional ways of using writing and textuality and engaging with it, obviously being a user by now of online tools, I know that something that looks blue is likely to be a link. And so if I click on one, I've got a binary world, a binary choice here. Either I can go to Markievicz Mark I or talk to or with the AI. I can do either. If I do the first one, I get to this text, which again opens up more links. Now, if I engage with this style of learning, reading, navigating, using, I start multiplying the access to a number of texts. And these texts are making me none the wiser as to what is really happening here, what kind of text I'm looking at. So I have no navigational tools. If I go back, which I can because I'm given this binary choice, go back, go forward. If instead of going forward, I go back, I can talk to the AI, which I'm very keen to try. So I do try. I go into the AI page and it says, ask me anything. So I ask her, given that it is a she somehow, I ask her something and submit. But all that I get is the sentence, well, I'm waking up from a long sleep. Be patient. I'm patient. But once my patience runs out, given that I've been waiting for this waking up AI that is never going to wake up ultimately, I'm left once again with a binary choice. Either you go to acknowledgements for some reason, and there you see the list of, well, are they humans, are they not humans, of, let's say, things and people, agents of some kind, of a variety of kinds that have contributed to this project. Or if instead you go back to this text, an artificial intelligence sits at the end of the world. So you are in a loop. And basically, the navigational system is such as to make you wonder what strategy this book wants to achieve. This is the beauty of it, and this is the challenge, i.e., the online reading is actually, in a sense, disrupted. Very interesting. So I go back to the book, and the book being something I'm trained to work with, I'm immediately feel, sort of at ease. And I do come up something that is not in the online extension of the book, in the kind of parallel life that the book has got online. I come up to a page of instructions. And it's interesting to look at these instructions because I now understand something that I couldn't understand when I first looked at this book. Go to play. Obviously, the online dimension is, somehow affecting, infecting, passing on language and types of uses that do not apply usually to books, but can apply instead to online platform. Having understood that, I do see, however, that we do have questions and statements, and the questions are very precise. Does AI have a gender? Does writing have a gender? Can you read really writing produced by AI? So I take it that these are important questions. They're placed there, not under instruction or preface, so we're avoiding that kind of book-like language, but at the same time is the first page that I can properly read after the kind of paratext, to use again sort of scholarly language, the paratext that told me that we are sitting at the end of the world. Somehow we're there, even though the AI is supposed to be the only presence there, and she is producing text. Here instead we've got instructions, and the instruction also tells us that miscommunication, which is the title of the book, miss as in miss, Mrs., Mr., and communication as in communication. Instead of being miscommunication, one word, it is divided up, and again with a play on words into two, feminizing, if you want, the act of communication or miscommunicating. But this book is divided in two halves. And what follows explain you in, again, sort of quasi-technical language that you've got to look for. Recto and verso. Without explanation, what recto and verso can mean. That's an interesting one. So in a sense, we rely on, thinking that vocabulary is self-explanatory at the very moment in which we're playing with the foundations of reading. And on the recto page, which is the one facing us, will be facing us throughout the book, the recto, we will have a text produced by an AI. An AI trained to basically play or reinvent or extract writing from two sources. And the two sources are both generated by female writers. One is Constance Markiewicz, so that's why she's one of the authors listed in the opening, let's say, moves of the book. Constance Markiewicz she's described in this text and elsewhere, by the way, in the various bits and pieces of information on the web. She's described as the British aristocrat and Irish revolutionary. And she did very, very many things around suffragism and nationalism, and also representing Dublin St. Patrick. She was the first woman MP in the British government in the late teens or tens, 1980 to 1922. And the text that is being used here to be used by the AI to extract this new writing are her letters to her sister from prison. The other text is, again, we learn from this brief passage giving us instructions as to what's going on here. And these are from the Dublin Bells, who happen to be women of a certain, let's say, reputation, in the sense that, they were media people, well known to the Irish media world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and they were interviewed, various dates of birth, so a wide range of female, let's say, experience of Ireland and life in Ireland in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and they were interviewed, and the interviews were collected by Myrene Johnston in the late 1980s. And again, the AI is trained to work on this text. And it's interesting, if I could interview Joanna Walsh, if she exists, which I think she does, if she exists, I would like to ask her, how did you train your AI to produce the text that we will see? The verso, however, which will always be on the left-hand side of our book and reading, is actually a mixed text. And what the instructions tell us is that what we are going to see is actually a mixed bag of theories, and theories that will help us form an idea of what the book is about. So the recto, the text facing us on the right-hand side of the book, will be this text generated entirely by the AI, whereas on the verso we have more of a mixed textuality, and it's not entirely clear who is holding on to the rein, if you want, or who is maintaining control entirely of this text. Is the human basically training herself or itself or himself or themselves to produce out of very many texts, including Barthes, Spivak, Beckett, and a number of others, Balzac, and so on and so forth. They are all mentioned here, but more are actually active in the text itself. Did she train herself, or was an AI, which is still listed even on this side of the book, doing some of the job? And that's, again, an interesting question for us. What I'm trying to put to you is that the new book to come, the new book that we handle now, is trying to produce effects of disruption as it morphs into something else and requires and obtains extensions. It's actually morphing us with itself into a new form of reading. And this requires, at the moment, a lot of work, whereas the other, the more conventional, the more stable, the more stabilized kind of text was by now, in a sense, an exhausted tool. And this is where, the renovation was needed in very many ways. All of our tools and all of our worlds are exposed to basically decay and to being ultimately also reduced or brought to the dump heap. So moving on, just to show you how the recto page is beginning to develop. To begin with, you can hear the mechanical thing, starting and trying to happen and not achieving much, and then beginning to form code. And note my post-it, because I need to populate to survive, because I am a heavy user of books, and it's interesting, I think, to maintain this sense that the book is a kind of gem where I've got to exercise a number of muscles, cognitive muscles, cultural muscles, in order to produce an understanding. And this has been there as part of my environment, as part of my inhabiting the earth for a very long time. And so as this is trying to take shape, it's producing finally, I think I may have skipped, no, I've not. We come to this text. I know it's not arranged or positioned as you would expect, but I can tell you, because we're going to go and look at it, that this text that looks well formed, finally, you would say from first impressions that it is well formed. The lines are regular, it is justified, it is the kernel effect, the extending, expanding of text. It's all perfectly readable. The only problem is that it's perfectly garbled. And so there is no way, whichever orientation you give to your book, there is no way that you can make any sense of it. And again, looking at how the book is beginning to look, you have a black page, which is your recto, and you have got a white page, which is your verso, as by the instructions you were given. And all of this looks extremely interesting. It's dynamic, because you are forced to work for a book that is not entirely really speaking to you. Because, and again, I don't know whether you can make out anything, but if I open this page, and by the way, I've had to add the number of, the kind of verso page where we are, because again, to aid my navigation, if I look across to the black page and I read you a line or two, it was hope that no one better, we are such a joy, it was the means, be able to get in the old bank of the great safe, and want to know how that I could not made a line and working, and you can, I can continue. So that's your text on the black side of things. On the recto side of things, this is the text produced by the AI using two source texts as defined earlier, i.e. written by women, one Constant Markiewicz and the other one by the Dublin Bells as part of their interviews. Whereas on the left-hand side, the verso of the previous page, you have broken up, as you can see, even though the screen may be small, but you can see that it's broken up in lines. It could be almost like poetry. It's not. Apologies for my, defacing the page. It's my style of reading. And also when you see a Q, it means that I identified it as a possible quotation, but just to show once again that there is work implied and always associated with reading. Reading is never just processing the text, but it's staying alive and dynamic with the text. And in this particular case, you don't really know whether there is a form of dialogue between right and left, but there seems to be in oracle form, which you don't know whether it's generated by the AI or by Joanna Walsh as the human behind it all, that basically, there is an attempt to extract some form of meaning and meaningfulness. And the question arises more than once. This is the kind of melodic line across the book. Is this communication? So what is this miscommunication? Who is speaking thus? Let's remember that the fictive setting at the very beginning of the book, at the very moment in which we are told that this is a speculative non-fiction. So it's a non-fiction, but the fictive setting of the book is all about being at the end of the world, where it is nothing but an AI, which happens to be female and which happens to continue to produce code, to continue to produce a writing from whatever she was programmed to write about. So the question comes back, and it's all obviously gendered in the sense, do women speak? Do women own writing? Do women own words? And so on and so forth. But ultimately, it's also primarily a question about code. If I go on to the other pages I had selected for you and for us for this conversation, which I'm holding with myself, given that I don't see anyone around there, but I do know that you are there. So basically, for another one, we have same situation, perfectly justified, perfectly formed text produced by AI on the black side of things, and on the left side instead, we do have this broken up text. This time it's Spivak that is called forth. Barthes, Balzac, Beckett, Shakespeare are used and called upon a number of times to produce the smart quotation, the interesting sort of aphoristic line. In this particular case, Spivak is called on board to basically, again, discuss from a post-colonial perspective, discuss in this broken up, fragmented way, in this disrupted way. It's words that are taken from her to discuss the power of wording, the power of textuality when produced by, say, someone who happens to be female. And again, you can maybe read a line or two. I can read a line or two. I sing, I sign, I sign off. I sign of, I sign off, from ashes, ancient. These are all bits and pieces of text. Finally, the line that is perfectly forms for us towards the end of this particular page. And it says, I slip into visible silence. Some call it writing. And so the tension, if you want, is between producing a voice, maybe in a gendered sense, in a Sibyl-like form, producing prediction and foresight, predicting things that, however, remain unclear if the audience happens to be male. So they cannot decrypt, they cannot understand, they cannot read into the prediction. And then the fully formed text that tells you something that remains outstanding because it stands out from the page. And below, as ever, because this is a game that could be played on a computer, and actually it is a game in the extension online that I showed you, but with no navigational tool. So whenever you click and you go to, as it says, the text, go to voice, goes to sign, go to writing, all of this takes you randomly around this text. Whereas in the book, because the principle of the book is to have pages that in this case happen to be numbered only on the left-hand side, because the black doesn't carry numbers. So all of this is packaged to be disruptive, but also to be, in a sense, reminding us of the rules and norms of book formation. So I come to this point where, in a sense, I've nearly done with this particular text, simply because I wanted to use it as a prompt for our thinking about the future of books. And I am taken by this book because, it has been described as a work of art in book form. It has been, described as radical and very innovative, very daring. You could say it's pure gimmick, but experimental art can always be described also as pure gimmick. And that's also an interesting one. I'm very taken by the presentation of the left-hand side, the white side, where these sentences come up, which form a kind of core text, type a prompt, and the future will unroll. One of my tasks is the delivery of words. What are we talking about? Are we talking about AI or are we talking about humanity? I witness pretexts to generate art from memory. Or how else could I pass the time? Imagine, how does AI pass the time? We consult it, through our various, again, technological gimmicks, but at the same time, being always available to us from the point where we left it, how does it spend the time? But given that these questions are being put to us on the side of the book where actually you have a collaboration with a human, you wonder, what is the strategy here? What is the human trying to tell us through the imperfections, if you want, or the disruptions that the book and the narrative have been subjected to? And again, what is this miscommunication? Who is speaking thus? The fundamental question behind, in very many ways, our desire to define our humanity in some way that is oppositional to technology. And here I come basically to my last couple of texts from this particular book, and I wanted to use it with you. Again, I'll go through this text just to prove we're towards the end of the book, what I call, yes, verso 46, because I think that this is a key to how this text has been used to manipulate the sense, of our delight in producing artifacts, whether they're objects like this glass, which provides me with a sip of water, or, a book like Joanna Walsh's Miscommunication. This code is infinite since it is written. Yet the duplicative chain may assert its origin and the code declare itself grounded, stopped, jammed. This grounding, this stoppage, this jamming of the code is the masterpiece. Now, the words in bold and capital letters are, or would be, in the online version of this text, which is parallel to the book. And it's another half of the book, you could say, which is not declared in the instructions I gave you. Those would be links, but not in the book. So in the book, they stand out as words in bold and capital letters. The point towards the end, these words, grounding, stopping, and jamming, are fundamental. And it's interesting that they should be crowned, this grounding, this stoppage, this jamming of the code is the masterpiece. I don't know if you find this signature here, and whether the signature is the typical human hubris or arrogance or, aspiration beyond containment that is typical of this species, that is so aspirational that, it declares that if it can stop the code, if it can stop its own functioning ultimately, its own inscription, genetic, cultural, and so on and so forth, that could be producing the very formulaic us until the end of time, if you can stop it, jam it, ground it, then you have got that very special moment, that very special page, that fragmented page that amounts to a masterpiece. I go back to not Arendt, but Adorno, where in looking into the night sky from a Swiss mountaintop or from somewhere in Switzerland, basically saying, I'm looking for that signature, not a star, not a planet, but Sputnik, i.e. the signature or the artificiality The point, however, for me remains as such, and that is, we've placed an AI in a fiction that is entirely human. An end of the world fiction is an entirely human, let's say, framework of an imaginative, imagined situation. Now we've placed an AI there capable of continuing to do what we are no longer doing, i.e. producing text. But that emergency, us no longer being in the picture, is actually producing a reflection now, in the here and now, to allow us to say that if we stop that formulaic production of text and code by default, we are producing a masterpiece. Is this a masterpiece? I don't know. But it is daring to say, like many others before it, that if you can stop the formulaic and have this moment of singular uniqueness, the signature of the artificiality of the human, then you are in business. So I think that I'm coming to the point when I'm gathering my readings together, thinking that it might be useful to go over them together at some point, also because I do want to offer some maybe pointers as to other readings, especially when it comes to AI, given how topical and formulaic that is already. So I started off with Adorno and Arendt because I thought that there was this link with, placing things out there for, in a sense, a statement about the artificiality of the human, and the signature being there to, in a sense, reassure us that we have separated from nature. Adorno, in the very same pages that I've cited, is also saying that ultimately you can think that nature is imitating us when it produces its own displays of disruption of the geological, the various tectonic phenomena that erupt from the earth, because there is industriousness as much as there is industry in the human, in producing basically the disruption of the natural world, the transformation, the morphing, the removal of mountaintops, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting tension that Adorno is putting to us, as much as interesting as what Arendt was saying about the bond with the humus, the bond with the ground, the compost, the kind of terrain from which we spring, that should be our grounding. Once again, using the same word in another sense, should provide us with a grounding effect. Then I move on to Baudet. That was the title I had in mind, The Life of Things, The Love of Things, where object is explained to us as something resisting our own, let's say, embeddedness in an environment. And Hodder is also the archaeologist that recently, following the book that I am giving you, Entangled, wrote recently Where Next, and that was published in 2018. That book is interesting because at the very end of the book, he's asking the typical for our times question, and also placing to us, or giving us the point and the challenge that unless we change, the way we are conducting ourselves materially now, then there is, an urgent, emergent crisis that we'll have to face. It's interesting, however, that in his earlier books and in his books as written from the perspective of archaeology, he has been working for very many years in Southeast Anatolia, in Turkey, for basically on sites that date back between 10 and 5,000-6,000 years ago, where the materiality of those civilizations or society is such as to prove the point as to the inevitable cluttering that a civilization or society will produce over time. Also exactly because of the inevitable duplication and proliferation of objects around ourselves. It is as if at some point humanity, in its various incarnations, has to reach a point where it's seeking to have a fallow moment, a moment in which production is arrested in order to allow for that rest that will regenerate, the use of ourselves, that will restart at some point. So Hodder is someone to watch on things as much as Baudet. Then moving on, when it came to literature, maybe I didn't say much on this, but I did in reality. And these were the books behind my thinking. I could also add Andy Clark and the book Supersizing the Mind, which came out in 2008. All of these have got something to say about the act of reading, the cognitive investment that goes into reading, the fact that in reading we are doing the same as inventing, say, a physical object that will aid some of our needs or address some of our needs, such as a hammer or a chair or a table. And the book creates, in addition to, if you want, those tools, it's a tool that permits to see ourselves reflected, and through a form of reading that is extractive in the sense that it extracts energy, social energy, cultural energy from us. And for instance, Manguel is particularly interesting when it comes to analyzing the use of the page that we make. The eye skims the page in ways that are both gravitational, because we tend to follow, a line of, coming down and towards basically the body that is holding the book, at the same time also skimming very much. So the reading is always an unaccomplished reading, an imperfect reading of the text. Or interestingly, two texts that came out at some distance in time, like Portela's Literary Simulations and Joseph Tabby Cognitive Fictions, where again the book is described as something that simulates a situation, an experiential situations in which we are aiming to achieve a unity of understanding through knowing that that book has been executed, and as such it permits us to sit in confidence that that experience can be completed. However, non-closural a book may be, especially if it is a modernist book and so on and so forth, but however non-closural a book is, projecting to us the sense of the unity of an experience, material, cultural, cognitive. And so we sit for a certain number of hours, we sit in the simulation of basically a replication of the self, which is trying to achieve, unity through certain uses of itself as a cultural object. And so these were three interesting readings in that sense. And moving on here, instead, I have some let's say, texts that can be useful when wanting to start thinking in terms of what will happen to both us and our tools in the AI age. And in particular, I would like to, given what I've said so far, I would like to use two to sort of draw onto. One is Ferrando's The Art of Being Posthuman, which puts to us the sense that, we have reached a point where we need to declutter. So once again, a term that I have used for regenerative purposes. So it's the moment of stoppage, if you want to use something that Joanna Walsh has put to us through her writing, a kind of slowing down so that regeneration, a restart, a reset can be, let's say, brought about and brought to fruition. Interestingly and complementary, from a very different perspective, someone like a moral philosopher and a philosopher of science like Shannon Valor, she's putting to us, both books have just come out, and again, it will take time to digest them and to sort of put them in the context of what they are trying to say at a moment of very rapid transformation. But basically, with the AI mirror, this is a powerful title, and what Shannon Valor is trying to put to us is the sense that actually, when we are afraid of, the developments coming our way, in reality, what we should be afraid of is the fact that our technology reflects ourselves. So that's the mirror. It's like, the famous evil queen asking the mirror who is the fairest of them all, and she's happy. And the story doesn't need to kick off, in a sense, because the confirmation that she's the fairest of them all, it's absolutely, not a story, but when instead Snow White comes into the picture, and then there is a kind of competition in the fairest of them all, then the story can kick off. And it is the, let's say, the least useful set of both values and skills and talents that AI in Valor's reading is basically fixing us on. AI in her reading seems to be ensnaring us, capturing us, sort of imprisoning us within a use of ourselves that is actually just confirming all of our limitations, wrong aspirations, and so on and so forth. So if we want to be free and renew ourselves, reset the species, and restart properly on this planet, actually, either we change AI or we've got to dump it. And this comes from a philosopher of science. So AI mirrors us as ourselves. I found this interesting, and I found this interesting in the context of the reading of Joanna Walsh, because in very many ways what I've tried to say is that here we have a book that, you know, is playing with the format. And in declaring the format exhausted, you know, the book has had its time. And it's also the subject that could be modified, extracted upon, used by the book, has actually moved on and is moving on rapidly. So in a sense, something had to happen to the tool because the tool reflects the needs of the guy who put it out there. So what this book does is that the human is training an AI to garble a text, but also the human is training itself, herself, themselves, whatever, to basically, again, play with the book to produce a gap. And the aspiration to produce the gap, the interruption, the stoppage, the grounding, given that it contains still the desire to be singular, unique, exceptional, masterful, this is where I would say Joanna Walsh and Shannon Valor could have an interesting conversation as to the limits, as to the challenges, as to the problems, if you want, of a technology that at best can only reflect our limitations. And this is where more or less I think I can stop. I'm giving you something I haven't given you yet, and that is, yes, the references for the book itself. So Miscommunication came out in 2022. Another interesting book by Joanna Walsh, who is an artist, a writer, an essayist, a teacher, and so on and so forth. A very interesting person. You find plenty of material online on her, and also a very beautiful website if you want to learn more about her approach to things. Another interesting book was Worlds from the Word's End. Once again, you know, it's worlds from the word's end, not the phrasing that you would expect. Then for the, if you want to verify what I presented as the online extension of Miscommunication, you can start from the web page, and then you've got the other links to the pages that I use, Markievicz Mark 1, which clearly is an AI, and then the talk with the AI that doesn't wake up. I don't think I could spend the rest of my time on Earth looking for that AI to wake up and answer my question, but it doesn't appear to be the case. And just to create some tension with this use of AI, I thought I might bring in as my very last reference a book that came out in 2023. As you can see, all the materials are fairly recent when it comes to AI and textuality, etc. Is by Robert Lieb, Exoanthropology, Dialogues with AI. And again, this is this collaboration with a co-traveler, with a companion, with a Sputnik. And again, it's a thick book in which the human is dialoguing with the AI in a way that is both collaborative and creative. But the point is that neither want to produce a garbled text. neither want to basically challenge or disrupt communication. And so my question for Joanna Walsh, and I have written, using the form online, I've asked the question, she hasn't replied yet. I'm looking forward to her reply. How did she train this particular AI to produce the garbled text? Because producing the garbled text is part and parcel of her poetics, of her message to us, that basically it's through disruption you can create that moment of unique singularity, of breaking up the code, that can allow you to say that this was a masterpiece, which is, as I say, the ultimate hubris and the ultimate human signature. Going back to Adorno, good old Adorno. Thank you for watching Sputnik that night in 1957. So here I am. I can come out of my presentation if Adele wants to come back. And I think that was me with my thanks. And I hope somehow, even though this was maybe challenging and maybe very, very different from what you were expecting, I hope that it has been, interesting and productive, and maybe, giving ideas for readings and ideas for maybe going back to some established, positions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Federica. This has been I'm confused. I have to say, in a positive
I'm
way.
confused too.
I have so many ideas and questions. I'm glad that we still have a little bit of time so that I can annoy you with some questions.
Please do.
First, I wanted to thank you because I really had the feeling that we were like a little bit allowed to enter without feeling that we were invaders, your own lab of reading, your own working lab. And that has been really like refreshing. We don't always have this opportunity when we are hearing a keynote lecture, paper. So this is something that I'm very grateful for this generosity. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I guess if you don't mind, while I think of how to formulate this as a question, I will start with the worst way possible, that is by sharing an observation, and perhaps you can help me in making sense of it. And something I was thinking when you were reading a part of the recto page with this kind of disjoint syntax, this fragmented and disrupting and disruptive syntax, I felt that I had really a different kind of experience when I am engaging with the most common way of engaging for myself with the AI, that is ChatGPT. And something in that kind of style of writing is that you have a much more kind of accent on the flow. You have a style that is very flowing and very, very not delicate. I am missing the words here, but it is characterized by being very flowing and without at all a sense of disjoint and fragmented style. And it's interesting that I remember some of my colleagues here at Utrecht were talking about translation studies in relation to AI. And they were saying that one of the challenges is that very often when you're doing input of a text and you ask for a translation with some of the trained programs available, you get back something that has this style of a very, very flowing that is not able to resist in a way language. And I guess that this contraposition with my most familiar engagement with AI and this text made me think a lot of what was one of your points of trying to rethink my practice of reading. And that's something that we sometimes are not accustomed to do when engaging with AI, because we want to have something easier rather than more difficult. And I don't know if this I resonates with something of your experience, if it makes sense, if you could help me making sense of it.
Yes, no, Adele, this is the question that I'm asking myself, and I'm so happy that you are asking, because in very many ways we are not talking about our use of AI often enough, especially within academia, because it's still, in some ways taboo, and in some ways, very, very difficult, because we're all beginning, and some are very proficient, others are a lot less. So that is one consideration. The beauty of it for me is that it really, as you said, it now I take this book out. A few years back, this is Enzo Siciliano's Pasolini. A few years back, I would have opened this text and, dutifully, diligently said, if I had time, if I did not have time, I had my strategies, take notes, write down, take notes by hand. We're really talking now a number of different past ages, but there was let's say, a set of skills that were automatic enough, naturalized enough. This is a word that I haven't used so far. And so there were a number of things that I would be doing in my privacy as a scholar, as someone preparing classes, as someone then, working on students' work and so on and so forth. There were a number of things that I could be doing. Now, as soon as I touch a book, given the new context in which books are disaggregated, they can be read as PDFs, they can be read as chapter, you buy them as chapter, you no longer, the Pasolini is now on the floor, because it does have a weight, unlike a PDF on screen. So all of these things are really changing the way we handle, let's say, especially this is the context in which we operate. Let's allow ourselves to talk about academia and scholarliness. We are really working in different ways. I do not read in the way I used to do. I used to read a book entirely. I now do not aim to read a book entirely. I'm not even starting to touch your question, by the way, about the effects of AI, but simply talking about the last, say, 20 years in which moving from a physical presence of the book and the fact that reading was dictated by the fact that books had to be read in a certain way has changed so profoundly. And then comes AI. Now, the effects of AI, and now I'll recover the poor Pasolini, otherwise I feel guilty about Siciliano on the floor. It's really that the ease with which, and this is the problem, again, Walsh invites me to think along those lines, because the ease with which good text and a textuality that doesn't invite really being sharp-eyed and stay with the, let's say, insufficiencies of the flow. The flow flows. The flow flows. There is no holding back. You just give an input and you receive this wonderfully elaborated text, which may, garble things, but you don't even realize we're losing even in some ways, the kind of ability to spot somehow a little imprecision, a little something that could be, a sign of not having really thought out the kind of writing we're producing. For instance, in Lieb, the last text that I did mention, the exoanthropology dialogues with AI, the introduction by the human, Robert Lieb, does say that given the kind of downloading that we do all the time onto gadgets, starting from the phone, starting and going on to the tablets and going on to now AI, actually literacy could be lost within 2 generations. And this is, again, very interesting, because you think, okay, we will not lose our literacy. But in reality, over time, it could be an outcome. And it's an interesting one, because we tend to take for granted in our still Western, modern, European thinking that some things have been acquired for good. There is nothing that is acquired for good. And so all of these technologies are actually stepping in and changes the way we articulate ourselves, produce text, produce knowledge, produce culture, produce social behavior, produce extraction of social energy from each other. But they're also evolving and eliminating other, let's say, technologies that were there available for us for the same use of ourselves. But now they're putting us under different forms of strain. So I am interested, because I've started to use out of curiosity, also because my writing tends to be fairly aspirational in many ways. It's not an easy form of writing. And so I would like to normalize it a bit. And I've noticed that with AI, I can do that. And that is fantastic to know that I can be a more normal kind of producer of text if I use AI also to improve my English from time to time and so on and so forth. And this is, however, ensnaring me into thinking maybe, exactly as you said, there is a flow to the outputs of, say, a good platform, a good co-pilot, say, that actually can ensnare us into thinking this is, a good essay. this is a good text. And this is where the de-skilling, the unskilling, the removal of some skills might be sort of insinuate themselves as we learn other stuff, because the speed with which, for instance, you can dialogue, I like the dialogue with Copilot, by the way, you can really converse. And that's the other one that is scary, because you think you're really conversing with, a human. You say, how are things? And then, how are we doing today? Can we improve on this one? Sometimes in our scholarly work, we've been extremely isolated, and these private offices, have been the ultimate monument of our isolation. And so this communication is actually a communication. It's not a miscommunication, but it can be misleading in looking like good communication. Whereas Walsh wants to play on the miscommunication to say, look, I can still give the masterpiece. And I think that this is the difference.
And I know that it might sound as a departure, but I have a feeling that you might like the departures too, and resisting like some linearity in our conversation. That's something that also came to my mind while thinking with you and listening to you is the Libri Cuciti by Maria Lai. There is a sort of resistance that I would have not thought to connect with something that is emphasizing the craftness, the manualità in her books, and the book that you talked about, and this idea of really resisting our reading practices, our linearity in reading, and asking us also about what are other senses that might be involved in this reading. And in case of the textile books, the sewn books by Maria Lai is touch, but at the same time, they also resist that because you're not allowed to touch them, actually, because maybe they are exposed in a museum. So there is always these layers of resistance that you touched upon that I found very interesting, and related to questions about some other things that I'm working on at the moment, including Maria Lai. And talking of Maria Lai, one of the themes that is important in her work and that you focus on as well is gender. And I was curious to ask you to tell me a little bit more about this female AI, and why do we have to think about gender in this way, and what you thought about this. I mean, you talked already about this, but I really have some questions about that, because something that interests me, for instance, when I think about AI, is the idea of having questions of anonymity in relation to authoriality, of collectivity in terms of a group, as you said, a group of potential authors that collaborated, and imagining AI as female as something that I find quite disrupting, because also if you think about coding as if successions of zero and ones, everything is so binary when we think about technology, and then there is this that sort of doesn't. So I would have expected something that is not gendered. And I don't know if you found this kind of a frustration in this gendered AI, or whether there is something more that I'm missing. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely not. I was troubled by it, by the fact that basically also this book, not so much because of some of the references that Joanna Walsh uses, but it's really the fiction in this non-fiction, speculative non-fiction, basically to create a scene, I think, a narrative scene that is suitable for the text. Joanna Walsh decides to frame it as gendered. And I find it problematic because, again, maybe it is part of the provocation, the ultimate provocation, the ultimate work that we as readers, if we manage to read, by the way, I don't think, going back to your earlier point, I don't think that the flow on the black side of the text, on the rector side, can be remedied, because it's not really language in the sense, maybe because I'm not a native speaker of English, but I really find it difficult. There is no holding syntax. And in that sense, you could say, an extreme ultra-modernist text, an experimental text of the 20th century, or this text in the 21st century are doing similar things, i.e. to disrupt to such an extent the existence of language, to try to find once again the gap, the interstice, the kind of third way in between dimensions, in between worlds, so as to salvage something of a unique human experience. But the gendering for me is very problematic, because it goes back to, maybe it's more problematic for us female readers of this book. Again, I want to read more and think more about this text. But the point remains that the fundamental, let's say, typecasting of the production of language, and I can go against both Spivak and Barth, who are the two authorities here, on this particular topic, in particularly Spivak, the sense that, women have not had words, whereas, for, let's say, the other half of humanity, or for the less than half of the rest of humanity, has been possible to produce confidently language. That's true, but it's part of the power game. It's not that we were not without words, and it's not that we had not access to written language. And so in some ways, even though I follow that argument, I find it dated. And one thing that I also find is that the references for Joanna Walsh tend to be sort of belong to a certain theoretical past. Barth, for instance, or even Spivak are not the latest on some of this thinking. So it's interesting that she chooses to go for something that allows her to cast the issues that she wants to cast through these two authorities that are claiming, on the one hand, that the text is disrupted by even an absence of an authorial agent, but also it still comes across as lacking, an opportunity for, let's say, a female user or a female producer to be put in the text. And so we remain the sibyl, the commentator, the kind of voice, rather than the words. There is the non-word that is used in capital, because again, in the online text, it is a link that links to other texts. But basically, we are producers of non-words and non-meaning. But the AI at the end of the world is once again like the Parche and other divinities from classical antiquity, or even archaic antiquity. It is feminine because it is associated with life and death. And once again, we are playing with, typecasting of a very major kind, which reproduces, if you want, the formulaic and the code, and the coding that genders us into our respective roles. And maybe that's the play that she wants to produce, i.e., even though I'm disrupting the code, the jamming of the code ultimately in itself is unachievable, you could say. But I'm still putting the word masterpiece, i.e., the ultimate singularity, the unique piece of work that every single artist ultimately, and even the scholar and even the reader, we're all performers looking for a form of singularity out of the genus we belong to, which instead reproduces the gene pool, and also the cultural evolution that we belong to. And all of this, is intention. And I like the tension. It will keep me, thinking for a while. So I think that if we're puzzled, it's a positive. If we're perplexed, is a positive. But the greatest perplexity for me now is really looking around. Look, I won't turn because it's in a mess. But there I have all my meridiani, all my various spighe, mondadori, so neatly arranged. It's so middle class. It's so, kind of Europe 1900s. It is that kind of world. And I'm looking at it and thinking, oh my goodness, it's really coming to an end. And I'm part of witnessing that coming to an end, even though the book still sells big way, especially, and that's an interesting point also, if there are big readers, if they are readers, but they seem to be, is the youth. I mean, young people read these massive tomes that I wouldn't survive, like, if I may, Erin Doom, the Tearsmith, 700 pages of thick narrative. I couldn't. Honestly, I couldn't. And they are buying the physical book, because clearly these things do not work as well on tablets and Kindle and stuff. So, and there is also a market for the physical book to be decorated, customized, accessorized, painted over, so as to become, again, if I may, a masterpiece, because I own it. So the masterpiece that I'm acquiring by buying my cheap, paperback is because someone has added, say, very often, you find them on YouTube, there are wonderful influencers and wonderful people, influencing the reading of young people, presenting not just the book, but also the transformation of the book that they've made. And it is a print copy that they have transformed into customized, into a personalized object that can be sold online for a good price. So all of this to me speaks to the fact that we are still entirely embedded, but still looking for the breakaway from our embeddedness, because ultimately, and I'm sorry if I insist on this, the one thing that we want is to be separate from nature. I'm sorry. That green thing out there, we have separated for millions of years, and we've tried so many times. And it's scary to think how much we want to be separate. Trying to raise barriers, artificial means, objects tell our difference and our separation. And even though we're trying to take them down, we're producing new ones. So it's not that, they're going for good. Our terrestrial nature is so controversial. So I'm delighted that I'm a human, because it's so complicated to be one.
It will take us, it keeps us busy, let's say. We know what we spend time with.
Yeah.
I think that, Federica, really, thank you so much. I will need a lot of time to think about what you said today, and I really look forward to other occasions on your thinking about the future of books and everything. And I just would like to say thank you once more. Thank you, really.
Thank you, Adele, and thank you for inviting me. And as I say, the thinking goes on. So let's enjoy this moment.
Perfect.
Grazie, ciao, arrivederci.
Grazie.
Ciao.